My name is Victoria Lane. I'm 39, and a week ago I thought I had a stable life. A husband, a home, a quiet job at the local library. But all it took was a will, a garage, and 15 minutes of silence to unravel it all. Before we go any further, please, if this story grips you, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone walk away sooner than I did. It started the morning after my grandfather's will was read. My sister, Julia Kerrigan, inherited his 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. I got a crumbling garage on the outskirts of Joliet, Illinois. No explanation, no note, just a set of rusted keys and a deed. When I told Richard, my husband of 15 years, he didn't even pretend to be supportive. "A garage?" he repeated, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Julia gets a fully furnished place in Manhattan, and you get a junkyard?" "It's not a junkyard," I said quietly. "It's a garage. From Grandpa." He scoffed. "Of course it is. You always did know how to aim low." I blinked, unsure if I heard him right. He set his fork down, leaned back in his chair, and looked at me like I was some science experiment that had failed. "You've contributed nothing to this marriage, Victoria. For 15 years, I've carried you. Your part-time paycheck, your library nonsense, your simple life ideals. I'm done pretending." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd always known Richard was proud, but I hadn't realized how deeply he resented me. I stood in stunned silence, still clutching the envelope that held the garage deed. "I paid the bills too," I murmured. "We split the mortgage, He laughed, a harsh metallic sound. "Your little librarian's salary barely covered groceries. Don't kid yourself. This house, this life, it's mine. And you? You're just here." My voice wavered. "Richard, you don't mean that." "I do." He stood up. "Pack your things. You've got half an hour. After that, I'm changing the locks." The room spun. This was our kitchen, our home. I had painted the cabinets myself, laid down the tile in the mudroom, cooked dinners for him for 15 years. But now, he was tossing me out like I was a stranger. I went to the bedroom, pulled out a suitcase from under the bed, and started folding clothes without thinking. My hands moved, but my mind was blank. I heard him pacing outside the door, sighing loudly, checking his watch like I was some burden he was finally unloading. 20 minutes later, I zipped the suitcase shut. I turned to leave, but he blocked the door. "The house key," he said. I reached into my coat pocket and slid the key off my ring. I paused for a moment, looking around. There was nothing left of me in this place except for the scent of lavender from my fabric softener. I placed the key gently on the entry table. "You're making a mistake," I said. He smirked. "No, I'm finally fixing one." As I walked down the driveway, the October wind whipped my coat open. The drizzle had turned into steady rain, but I didn't run. I just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, toward the only thing I had left. That broken, rusted garage my grandfather left behind. And at the time, I thought it was the final insult. I had no idea it would become my salvation. The rain came harder as I stood at the corner of Brook and Fifth, clutching my suitcase like it was the only thing left tethering me to the world. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or pound on the door begging Richard to take me back. Maybe 5 years ago I would have, but something in me had frozen. Not cold, not numb, just clear. The kind of clarity that comes after a storm hits, and you finally realize your roof is gone. I didn't have a plan. My parents were both gone. Cancer took Dad, and grief took Mom shortly after. Julia? She had made her opinion of me pretty clear after the inheritance reading. "Don't take it personally, Vic. Grandpa just knew I'd put the apartment to good use." Like I was incapable of doing anything worthwhile with a Manhattan address. I pulled out my phone, battery at 28%, my bank app still open from earlier, 361,774 left in my checking. Enough for maybe 2 nights in a budget motel and some bad takeout. But then what? My thumb hovered over Julia's number, then slipped back into my coat pocket. I knew what she'd say, or worse, how she'd say it. Instead, I walked. past old storefronts that had turned into vape shops, past the little bakery where Richard used to bring me cinnamon rolls when he still pretended to care. I found a bench across from Lincoln Park, sat down, and let the suitcase lean against my legs like a tired dog. That's when the silence hit. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that rings in your ears after a bomb goes off, the kind that makes you look around and realize, this is your life now. No house, no partner, no safety net. The inheritance. I dug into my coat pocket and pulled out the garage key. Heavy, brass, cold even through the fabric. I turned it over in my palm, remembering Grandpa's voice. Things aren't always what they seem, sweetheart. Sometimes what looks like a dead end is just a doorway that no one else bothered to open. I thought he was being poetic, or senile. But now it felt like a map, one I'd ignored because I thought I'd never need it. Could I really go there? Spend the night in some run-down garage in the industrial part of Joliet? I typed the address into Google Maps. 2 bus transfers, an hour and 40 minutes. And no guarantee the roof didn't leak, or that there weren't squatters already living in it. But it was mine, the only thing in this world that was. I stood up, adjusted the strap on my suitcase, and headed toward the bus stop. The ride was long, the windows fogged from the wet coats of passengers, the kind of quiet only found on late-night city buses, where no one wants to admit they've got nowhere else to be. As we rolled through the outskirts, the neighborhoods changed. Brick turned to concrete, lawns turned to gravel. The second bus dropped me 3 blocks from the garage lot. I walked the rest, the rain now just a mist, but the cold seeping straight to my bones. Rows of garages stretched into the dark, like soldiers lined up in surrender. Some had new padlocks and motion lights. Others were so rusted it looked like they hadn't been touched since the 80s. Mine was number 217. I found it wedged between 2 overgrown storage units. The lock looked like it hadn't been turned in years. The paint peeled in long strips, and weeds pushed up through the cracks in the concrete. For a moment, I hesitated. If I opened that door and found nothing, no shelter, no answers, what would I have left? I took a breath, slid the key in. It resisted. Then, with a loud clunk, it turned. The door groaned open. Darkness. I turned on my phone flashlight and stepped inside. What I saw made me stop cold. But I'll tell you about that in the next chapter. The metal door groaned open with the sound of time itself giving way. Loud, strained, resentful. I stepped inside, dragging my suitcase behind me like a ghost I couldn't shake. It was cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes your teeth ache. The beam from my phone cut through the darkness, catching on particles of dust suspended in the air. The garage smelled like rust and motor oil and something else, something faintly familiar. Grandpa. I whispered his name without meaning to. Peter. The garage was larger than I expected, deeper too. The walls were lined with rusted shelves, toolboxes, forgotten buckets. A workbench stood in the back, buried under a tarp and boxes. But what grabbed me, what pulled the breath right out of my chest, was the massive shape in the center of the floor. A car, covered by a gray tarp, sagging in places, but unmistakably elegant in its silhouette. I stepped closer, my shoes crunching on gravel and stray bolts. My fingers trembled as I reached for the fabric. It was thick, old, stiff with age. I pulled. The tarp slid with a hiss, revealing smooth black paint beneath, gleaming even in the limited light. Chrome fenders, wide white wall tires, a leather interior that still looked intact. A 1956 Ford Thunderbird. I gasped, stepping back. No way! Even someone like me, a librarian with zero interest in vintage cars, knew this was special. Pristine, valuable. This wasn't a junkyard find. This was love, sealed in steel and memory. Grandpa had told me stories about his first car. He used to light up in a way that made me think the man I knew, quiet, composed, impossibly precise, had once lived an entirely different life. I bought her with my first bonus, he once said. Black, chrome trim. She purred like she knew secrets. He told me he sold it when Julia's dad, my uncle, was born. Something about being practical, about family responsibilities. but he hadn't sold it. He'd hidden it. I walked around the car slowly. My fingers brushed the fender. The metal was ice cold, but there was warmth there too. History, intent. Behind the car was a wooden table, and on top of it, a box. Not just any box. Small, rectangular, carved in a way that immediately made me stop breathing. That same vine-like pattern from the garage key. I reached for it carefully, like touching something sacred. The lid was heavy. It creaked as I opened it. Inside, an envelope. A thick one, yellowed at the edges. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's unmistakable script, Victoria. Open when the time comes. I stared at it for what felt like a full minute. My pulse thudded in my ears. What time? Why now? My thumb brushed the edge, hesitating, and then I opened it. There were several pages inside, each covered in tight, slanted handwriting. But before I could read, something else slid out. A small key. Not like the garage one. This was delicate, silver, with a tiny crown at the top. I looked down at the Thunderbird. My breath caught in my throat. Was there more? I held the letter up to my flashlight and began reading, Grandpa's voice echoing through every line, pulling me deeper into the mystery he left behind. And just like that, standing alone in a forgotten garage with rain tapping the roof, I realized my life hadn't ended when Richard slammed that door. It had just begun. I sat on the concrete floor of the garage, legs curled beneath me, the envelope trembling in my hands. The rain had turned into a soft whisper against the metal roof above me, like the sky itself was leaning in to listen. Inside the envelope were 3 folded pages and that strange silver key with the little crown at its head. I laid the key on my thigh and unfolded the letter slowly. The familiar slant of Grandpa's handwriting made my throat tighten. My dear Victoria, if you're reading this, then you're standing in the place I always knew you'd return to. Eventually, maybe broken, maybe searching, maybe angry, or maybe all 3. But if you're here, it means the time has come. I stopped reading and looked around the garage. His words landed like a quiet confession, echoing through the dusty silence. How did you know? I whispered aloud, my voice too small in the vast forgotten space. This car. You've probably already seen it. She's a 1956 Thunderbird, the same one I used to talk about when you were little. I told everyone I sold her, but I didn't. I couldn't. She was too much a part of me. I turned to look at the car. It seemed different now. Not just metal and memory, but something alive, something waiting. There's something I never told you, Victoria. Something I never told anyone, except the people who once signed my paycheck. I wasn't just an engineer. That was my cover. In truth, I worked in a classified unit, a Cold War-era division that handled what you'd now call industrial intelligence. Not spying in the James Bond sense, but close enough. I blinked. I had to read the sentence again. Grandpa? My soft-spoken, garden-tending, crossword-puzzling grandpa had been a spy? I never lied to you. Not directly. But I never told you the whole truth either. I didn't want to burden you with the past until I had no choice, until I knew you'd need this. The weight of the moment sank deep. Grandpa hadn't just left me a garage. He had left me a puzzle box, and I'd only just found the lid. You've always underestimated yourself, Victoria. The world taught you to stay small, to stay quiet. But I never saw you that way. I saw fire in you, deep, patient fire. And now I need you to let it burn. I wiped tears from my cheeks with the sleeve of my coat. The key I've left you fits a compartment inside the Thunderbird. Hidden. Inside, you'll find documents, accounts, something that can help you rebuild. Not just your life, but your truth. Rebuild my truth? I looked at the car again, suddenly seeing more than leather seats and chrome trim. I saw something sacred, a legacy forged in silence and trust. One final thing, Victoria. Don't trust too easily, especially those closest to you. Sometimes betrayal wears a familiar face. The words landed like glass shattering in my chest. I knew exactly who he meant. Richard, Julia, all of it. I folded the letter carefully, reverently, and held the key in my palm. It felt heavier now, like a compass made of metal and memory. I stood, walked to the car, and opened the driver's side door. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and leather polish, impossibly preserved. I traced my hand along the seat's edge. There. A small, almost invisible slot in the side of the seat frame. The key slid in smoothly, like it had been waiting all this time. A quiet click. The panel shifted open. My breath caught. But I'll tell you what I found inside in the next scene. 3 days after unlocking the Thunderbird's hidden compartment, I found myself standing outside 1101 Park Avenue, right in the middle of Manhattan's curated chaos. Yellow cabs honking, women in power heels dodging puddles, a man in a tailored suit shouting into his AirPods. It felt like another planet compared to the cold garage I'd just left behind in Joliet. I shouldn't have come. That was my first thought as I stared up at the building. 12 stories of old-money elegance, with limestone walls and carved arches that whispered exclusivity. But I clutched Grandpa's file tighter against my chest, the papers still warm from my anxiety-fueled subway ride. Something inside me said I had to be here, that whatever was about to happen couldn't happen over the phone. Julia didn't answer the buzzer. Of course not. But the doorman, Cliff, said his name tag, gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Ms. Kerrigan is expecting guests later today. I'm afraid she's not available right now." "Tell her it's her sister," I replied. His smile faltered. "Oh." 1 moment. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then the glass doors clicked open. Penthouse. The elevator was paneled in walnut and smelled faintly of expensive cologne. My reflection stared back at me in the mirrored walls. Creased coat, damp scarf, wide eyes. I looked nothing like someone who belonged in a place like this, and yet I belonged more than Julia ever would. The penthouse door opened before I could knock. Julia stood in the doorway, barefoot in silk pajamas, holding a mimosa. She blinked in surprise, then slowly leaned against the frame, like she was deciding whether to slam the door or savor the moment. "Well," she said, voice syrupy, "look who finally crawled out of her garage." "Nice to see you too," I replied, stepping past her before she could stop me. The apartment was stunning. Minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, art that probably cost more than my entire savings account. But beneath the gleam, I could feel the cold. "I found Grandpa's car," I said. Julia arched a brow. "I thought you might. He had a soft spot for theatrics." "I also found the letter," I added, voice low. "The real one, not the public version the lawyers read." Her smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and slid it onto the glass coffee table. "I think you already know about the offshore accounts. The safe deposit box, the company he built in secret, and the people who tried to bury it after he disappeared from the public eye." Julia's eyes narrowed. Her mimosa tilted slightly in her hand. "You're bluffing." "Try me," I said. "There are account numbers in there. Proof that Grandpa left me full control, not just of the car, but of the holdings, the patents, everything tied to his legacy." She set her drink down harder than necessary. "You were always the sentimental one, Victoria. Always searching for meaning. Always thinking pain meant purpose. And you were always good at grabbing the crown before anyone noticed it was missing." She laughed, but it was sharp and hollow. "So what do you want? An apology? A payout?" I stood straighter. "No. I want you to stop pretending you earned any of this. And I want the full deed transfer to the apartment." Julia froze. "Excuse me?" "It was never yours, not really. He left it to you publicly to protect me. But privately, he knew exactly what you'd do with it, and with me." Julia's silence cracked into something uglier. She took a step forward, voice low. "You're not built for this world, Vic. You think a couple of old documents and a car make you powerful? You're still the same scared little girl reading fairy tales in the corner while the rest of us played chess." I met her gaze. "You're right. I was scared. But now I know the rules." I walked to the door, folder still in hand. "Oh, and Julia?" I turned back. "I made copies. One's already with a lawyer. And the other?" "With a reporter." her face drained. I didn't wait for her reply. As the elevator doors closed, I finally exhaled. This wasn't just about a car or an apartment. This was about truth. My truth, rising from the wreckage of everything I'd been told to believe. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer standing in someone else's shadow. 3 days after my visit to Julia's penthouse, I found myself standing inside an old bank in downtown Chicago, its marble floors slick with polish, the kind of place where silence hangs heavy and every footstep echoes like a secret being told. The vault was deeper than I expected, past 2 sets of doors and a retinal scanner that startled me with its sudden whir. The key Grandpa left me, small, silver, crowned, fit perfectly into box 3197. The lock clicked open with the soft finality of a chapter ending. Inside was a leather-bound folder, thick with papers that looked older than I was. Next to it, an engraved fountain pen, and beneath that, a flash drive in a velvet pouch. I stared at it for a long moment before sitting down at the table provided in the back corner of the vault. The walls felt like they were pressing in, but I needed the stillness. Opening the folder, I saw the heading, Peregrine Systems, Internal Memoranda, Eyes Only. My stomach clenched. Peregrine. It was the name Grandpa had circled several times in his private letter. A defense contractor he'd worked for in the 70s. I had assumed it was just another Cold War relic. But these papers said otherwise. There were purchase records, patent blueprints, shell companies registered across 3 continents, and then, toward the back, a confidential agreement dated 1991, just a year before he suddenly retired. It stated that Peregrine Systems had violated multiple federal laws, unauthorized surveillance on U.S. soil, bribery of public officials, and, most damning, suppression of a clean energy prototype developed by Grandpa himself. My throat went dry. He hadn't just built machines, he'd built hope, and someone buried it. The final page bore a note scribbled in Grandpa's hand. If they ever come after you, don't run. Expose them. Everything you need is here. Evidence, passwords, names. It's time someone told the truth. I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Then I plugged the flash drive into the bank's provided secure laptop. Video files, scans, audio recordings, some of them dated as recently as 2018. Grandpa had kept digging even after retirement. Quietly, methodically, and now he had passed that torch to me. One video in particular stood out. I clicked it. Grainy footage. A boardroom. 6 men seated around a polished table, their faces partially obscured, but not enough to hide their identities. One of them was a sitting senator. They were discussing a contract adjustment, phrased carefully to mask what was clearly a bribe. I slammed the laptop shut, heart racing. This wasn't just a family mystery anymore. This was explosive, world-shifting, and dangerous. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You've made it further than we expected. Let's talk. Soon. I froze. My first instinct was fear, pure and unfiltered. But then, under it, something steadier. Resolve. I slid the documents back into the folder, tucked the flash drive into my coat pocket, and stood up. I wasn't just the granddaughter of a retired engineer anymore. I was the keeper of a truth people had paid to bury. And I wasn't going to run. I didn't sleep the night after opening the safe. The weight of the documents, the flash drive, the names, they pressed against my chest like bricks beneath the surface of my breath. I sat by the window of my tiny studio apartment, watching the city buzz below, neon lights bleeding through cracked blinds while the world carried on, blissfully unaware of what I now knew. In the stillness, Grandpa's words kept echoing. Don't trust too easily, especially those closest to you. The next morning, I did what I hadn't done in over a year. I called David. Not because I trusted him, but because I needed someone who knew how power moved in this country. And David, my ex-fiancé, was as close to Washington's inner circle as one could get without being elected. He picked up after 2 rings. Vic? His voice was confused, guarded. Wow, I didn't expect... I need to talk, I cut in. Not about us. About something bigger. He hesitated, then said quietly, "You still at your place?" "Yeah. I'll be there in 20. When he arrived, the same navy coat I once loved slung over his arm, I saw the flicker of old affection cross his face. Then he spotted the documents laid out on my kitchen counter. "Jesus," he murmured, stepping forward. "Is this real?" I nodded. "And it's just the surface." He flipped through the top file, his brows drawing tighter. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather kept it. Hid it. He wanted someone to finish what he started." David exhaled sharply, resting his palms on the edge of the counter. "You could get hurt, Vic. This isn't just about exposing a few corrupt players. You're poking a sleeping monster." "I know. No, I don't think you do." He turned to me, eyes serious. "People vanish over less." I crossed my arms. "Then let them be afraid of me for once." He stared at me a long beat, something unreadable in his expression. "You're serious?" I nodded. "I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm asking if you still have that contact at the Chronicle." David looked away, jaw clenched. "He won't touch this without validation. Hard proof." "I have more," I said, pulling the flash drive from my coat. "But I want it released right. Not leaked, not spun, told." He slowly reached for the drive, but paused. "Once this goes public, there's no going back." I met his eyes. "I know, but I'm not going back anyway." He took it. After he left, I sat alone again, this time not in fear, but in choice. Everything in me could have walked away, could have let the past remain buried and protected what little I had left. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Not after what they did to Grandpa. Not after Julia's lies. Not after watching my name get crossed off every list that should have been mine. I opened my laptop and drafted the first email to a private investigator who owed me a favor. The second, to a patent lawyer. The third, to the head of a nonprofit clean tech firm that Grandpa had once silently donated to. If I was going to bring this to light, I needed more than evidence. I needed allies. I needed strategy. I needed to become the woman they never expected. My finger hovered over the send button before I whispered, "You gave me everything, Grandpa. Now it's my turn." Click. The choice was made. The mission had begun. If you'd told me 2 months ago I'd be standing outside a nondescript cafe in Washington, D.C., waiting to hand over classified documents to a Pulitzer-winning journalist, I would have laughed, or cried, or both. But there I was, wearing sunglasses I didn't need, palms slick despite the cool autumn air. The journalist's name was Riley Quinn, mid-30s, known for taking down 3 corporate giants and barely escaping a federal gag order. She was sharp, relentless, and unapologetically principled. Exactly the kind of person Grandpa would have trusted if he were still alive. David had made the introduction through back channels. Riley didn't work for any paper anymore. Too many enemies, not enough security. But she had reach and, more importantly, integrity. She arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a tan coat and jeans, with a messenger bag slung across her chest. She spotted me instantly. "Victoria Hale?" she asked, voice low. I nodded. "Thanks for coming." She gave a small smile. "Wasn't gonna pass this one up." We took a seat in the far corner of the cafe. I slid her the manila envelope I'd prepped. Copies of the most damning evidence. She flipped through them without flinching. After a few moments, she looked up. "You realize what you're sitting on?" "I do now." "This isn't just corporate fraud. It's decades of collusion, military, congressional, energy sectors. Some of these names are still in office." I held her gaze. "I'm not here to protect anyone." She leaned forward. "Why now?" I hesitated, choosing my words. "Because my grandfather died believing the truth would be buried with him, and because the people who silenced him think I'm too quiet, too soft, too expendable." A flicker of understanding passed over her face. "They're wrong," she said. I nodded. We agreed on a secure drop system, no digital communication, only encrypted drives and physical handoffs. Riley would cross-reference the files, verify everything independently. She promised nothing would go live until we had a clear strategy for release. "No leaks," she said. "When this hits, it has to land like thunder." I respected that. Before leaving, she paused at the door. "Just so you know," she said, "they're already watching. Anyone with access to this material, they'll come for you if they even suspect you're preparing to publish." "I'm ready," I said. "I won't scare easy." She gave a tight nod and disappeared into the DC haze. Back in my apartment that night, I couldn't sleep. Not out of fear, at least not entirely. It was something else. Something like anticipation. The kind of feeling you get before a storm breaks. Not dread, but a sense that something has finally shifted. And then came the email. No subject, no sender. One line, "You were warned." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, before closing the laptop slowly. Let them threaten. I wasn't alone anymore. I hadn't seen Julia in over 7 months. Not since the will was read. Not since she stood beside Richard with that smug little tilt to her head and said, "Well, I guess Grandpa always liked the simpler things." She'd gotten the Park Avenue apartment. I got the garage. So when I opened the door one rainy Thursday afternoon and saw her standing there, Prada heels soaked, trench coat spotless, clutching a monogrammed leather tote, I didn't speak right away. "Vic," she said with that same rehearsed warmth she always used when cameras were on. "Can we talk?" Part of me wanted to slam the door, but instead, I stepped aside. 5 minutes. She entered like she owned the place. Old habits. Her eyes scanned the small studio apartment, settling on the blueprint spread out on my coffee table. The wall behind it was littered with sticky notes, press clippings, and hand-drawn connection maps. "Looks like you've been busy," she said, eyebrows arched. "I have." I walked past her, deliberately unfazed. "Why are you here?" She removed her coat slowly, hanging it on the back of a chair like she used to at Grandpa's lake house, like we were still sisters. "Look, I know things didn't go smoothly after the will." I was angry, confused, maybe even a little unfair. I laughed, bitter. "You think this is about fairness?" "I'm just trying to have a conversation." "Then let's talk about how you got the apartment, Julia, or how Richard ended up with my share of the business account, or maybe how you knew about the garage and never said a word." Her expression tightened, but she held her ground. "I didn't think you'd care. You always acted like you wanted out of the family game." "Maybe I did," I snapped. "But I didn't deserve to be erased." She stepped forward, softer now. "Vic, you've always had heart, but no plan. You think it's noble to chase ghosts and dig up old files? This city eats people like you." I crossed my arms. Then maybe it's time someone changed the menu. A long silence stretched between us, the kind that only happens when the truth finally outweighs the performance. "I'm not here to fight," she said finally. "I'm here because I heard about the Chronicle, about the safe." My stomach clenched. "From who?" "David." "Of course." I stepped back. "So you're scared?" Her mask slipped, just for a second. "I'm not the enemy." "Then stop acting like one." Another silence. Finally, Julia sighed and picked up her coat. "You don't know what you're stirring up, Vic." I met her eyes, calm and clear. "I know exactly what I'm doing, and this time, I'm not backing down." She paused at the door. "This won't end well." "For who?" I asked. She didn't answer. After she left, I stood there in the quiet, breathing in the scent of wet concrete and adrenaline. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Because for the first time, Julia was the one looking over her shoulder, and I was the one holding the truth. The knock came just after midnight. I knew it was her before I even opened the door. Julia never could leave anything unresolved, not when she thought she still had a shot at winning. She stood there in a navy wool coat, hair damp from the drizzle, mascara smudged just enough to remind me that she used to be human once. "You could have called," I said flatly. "You would have ignored it." She wasn't wrong. I let her in. No words, just the quiet sound of her heels tapping across the hardwood floor of my apartment. The same apartment she'd mocked just a few weeks ago. She stopped in front of the wall, the one with all the pins and threads connecting faces, names, and transactions, the evidence, the betrayal, the truth. "You've built a war room," she said, almost impressed. I crossed my arms. "I built a map out of the lies you helped bury." She didn't flinch. "I didn't know everything," she said softly. "I knew what Richard told me, what Dad pushed, but not the rest. Not about Grandpa's whistleblowing, not about the offshore accounts or the shell companies." "You knew enough to stay quiet," I snapped. "That was the choice you made." "And what choice did you make?" she asked, voice tightening. "To burn it all down? To drag the family name through the mud?" "The family name was already covered in it," I shot back. "I'm just pulling it into the light." She turned away, exhaling slowly, fingers brushing a photo pinned near the edge of the wall. One of us as kids at Grandpa's lake house, arms around each other, covered in mud and popsicle stains. "You really think he left you that garage by accident?" she asked without looking at me. "No," I said. "I think he trusted me to do what none of you would." Her shoulders slumped, just for a second. And that was when I realized Julia wasn't here to argue. She was here because she couldn't sleep either. "We were different, even as kids," she murmured. "You with your little detective notebooks, writing stories about people doing the right thing. Me? I just wanted to be safe, protected." "Protected from what?" "From being left out," she said. "From being invisible." I blinked. "You think I didn't feel that?" She turned, eyes rimmed with something dangerously close to regret. "You were always Grandpa's favorite. You had his eyes, his stubborn fire. I had ambition. That was all I could offer. And you sold it to the highest bidder." Silence stretched between us, heavy and raw. She finally sat down at the edge of my couch, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed. "I'm not here to ask forgiveness," she said. "I just want to understand. Why now?" I looked her straight in the eye. Because for the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am, and exactly what I'm willing to lose to stay her. Her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was the ache of losing control over a sister she thought she could manipulate forever. "I never stopped loving you, Vic," she said. "I just forgot how to show it." I didn't reply. I just handed her a file from the edge of the coffee table. "What's this?" "The part you didn't know," I said. "Read it, then decide which side you're on." She nodded slowly and took it with her when she left. The door clicked shut behind her, and the rain kept falling outside. But something had shifted. For the first time, Julia left without a word of warning or a parting jab, and that silence meant more than any apology ever could. The truth always has layers, and I was peeling them back one paper cut at a time. It was 2:47 a.m. when the last email hit my encrypted inbox. Logan, my unlikely ally with a press badge and a moral compass, had delivered again. The file was titled simply, Riverwalk Holdings, Internal Memos. I clicked, and the ground beneath everything I thought I knew shifted again. My family hadn't just benefited from shady corporate dealings. They'd orchestrated entire policies, real estate takeovers, environmental bypasses, offshore laundering, using the very legal firm my father had once claimed was too dry for cocktail talk. There it was, in plain text, my grandfather's name removed from board records just months before his retirement. No reason, no statement, just gone. I pushed back from the desk, my breath shallow. My grandfather hadn't stepped down. He'd been erased. Silently, systematically, surgically. Just then, a knock. Not the hesitant kind, the kind that demanded to be heard. I opened the door to find Logan standing there, wind-blown and breathless. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, holding up his phone. "Your uncle just filed a motion to freeze all assets under Victoria Linwood, including the apartment." My spine stiffened. "He knows I've been digging." Logan nodded grimly. "He knows more than he should, which means someone's feeding him updates." I felt my stomach clench. "You think it's Julia?" "She disappeared from my radar 48 hours ago. Radio silent. That's not like her." My mind spiraled. The conversation we had weeks ago, the file I gave her. Had I handed her the match to burn me down? I paced the room, fists tight. If she flipped, this all collapses. Not necessarily, Logan said. You still have the proof, and we still have time. He dropped a thick manila envelope on the coffee table. This is from a former accountant at Riverwalk. He contacted me this morning, said your grandfather kept backup copies. Digitally signed, hidden somewhere. Where? Logan's eyes flickered to the old photograph on my wall, the one of Grandpa in his office. Back turned to the camera, a framed map of the Hudson River behind him. Somewhere nobody would question. I stared at the photo, suddenly seeing it differently. The map. Logan nodded. That office was cleaned out and locked. But the frame, it's custom, hollow-backed. I checked the specs. So we break in? No, I said, heart thudding. We walk in. He frowned. My grandfather left me that building. Legally. They just don't know it yet. I stood before the doors of Linwood Tower 30 minutes later. Rain slicked the streets behind me, and in my hand, I held the old brass key Grandpa had hidden beneath his workbench in the garage. The same one I'd nearly thrown out with a box of rusty screws. It slid into the lock like it belonged there. Inside, the scent of cedar and dust hit me like a wave of memory. We made our way up, Logan scanning for cameras, I scanned for ghosts. And then, in the corner office, behind the mahogany desk and the untouched leather chair, there it was. The map. My hands trembled as I unclipped it from the wall, flipped it over and peeled away the lining. Taped to the inside were 3 USB drives, labeled, sealed, marked with Grandpa's signature ink. Blue, always blue. I think we just found the kill switch, Logan whispered. No, I whispered back. We found the truth. Now we see who survives it. The cold hum of the hotel minibar filled the silence as I stared at the screen. 3 USB drives, 2 already copied, 1 left. Each one held decades of secrets, contracts signed in boardrooms under dim lights, hush money paid out with coded memos, silent partnerships masked behind shell corporations, and at the center of it all, my Uncle Richard's signature. Time and time again. I sat cross-legged on the plush rug of Logan's suite, his laptop propped open in front of me, while he scrolled through spreadsheets like a man searching for ghosts. Victoria, he said quietly, not lifting his eyes. This last folder, Project Salt. It's a ticking bomb. I leaned forward. How bad? Bad enough that if we publish this, you won't just be outing your family. You'll be naming federal contractors, members of city council, people who can make you disappear with a phone call. I stared at the screen, pulse drumming behind my eyes. And if we don't? They bury it again, and your grandfather's name stays tarnished. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, it wasn't hurried, but something in it made me freeze. Logan looked at me, then stood cautiously. He peered through the peephole. It's Julia, he whispered. My stomach flipped. After days of silence, she'd resurfaced. He opened the door. Julia walked in, hair wind-blown, eyes shadowed by something between regret and resolve. I know I vanished, she said softly. I didn't betray you. I crossed my arms. Then why did Richard know I'd gone to Grandpa's office before I even left the building? She exhaled. Because he's been tracking you. Not through me, through your phone, your car. He owns half the damn tower's security system. Logan and I exchanged a glance. Julia stepped closer. I came here to make something right. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside, an old gold fountain pen. My grandfather's. I blinked. Where did you— He gave it to me a week before he died, she said, her voice cracking. Told me you'd know when to use it, said you'd understand. I unscrewed the cap. Inside, barely folded, was a micro SD card. Logan plugged it in. It loaded instantly. Emails, notarized documents, video files, and one final folder. Will override official. I gasped. It was the real will, The one my grandfather had rewritten months after Julia's manipulation came to light. It named me as executor, sole authority over Linwood Holdings, and it outlined, in his own words, why he'd made the change. Because I was the only one who never asked for anything. My hands trembled. Julia wiped her cheek. He believed in you, even after I gave him every reason not to. A beat passed. Then I nodded. We release this. All of it, I said. No more secrets. No more fear. Logan looked up. Once it's out, there's no undoing it. I know. I turned toward the window, watching as dawn broke over the city, pink light bleeding into shadowed streets. This wasn't just about legacy anymore. It was about truth. About restoring the name of the man who built everything they tried to steal, and claiming the power they swore I'd never be strong enough to hold. The hospital room was quieter than I remembered hospitals ever being. No beeping machines, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rhythm of Dad's labored breath. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, hand on the frame, heart lodged somewhere between my chest and throat. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but diminished somehow. As if the lies, the secrets, the slow unraveling of who he was had hollowed out what remained. I stepped inside, slow and deliberate, the heels of my boots clicking faintly against the sterile tile. He stirred, opened his eyes. Victoria. His voice was a rasp, thin and unsure. I didn't speak at first. I pulled up the chair beside him, sat down, and folded my hands in my lap like I was bracing for impact. They told me you didn't have much time. He coughed, a weak, dry sound. I didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't. That landed. His gaze dropped to the blanket. I know I wasn't what I should have been. No, I said quietly. You were what suited you. Powerful, silent, and when things got messy, absent. He flinched, just a little, but it was there. I found the documents, I continued. The ones in the safe, the offshore accounts, the bribery trails, everything you buried with Grandpa's legacy. He didn't deny it. That surprised me. I thought I was protecting the family, he said. From the truth? I leaned forward. Or from your own reflection? Silence filled the space between us like fog. For a moment he looked out the window, where golden afternoon light filtered through the blinds in stripes. Your grandfather. He wanted too much from me, and I didn't want any of it. But I also didn't want to be nothing. So you sold his ideals for power. He turned back to me, tears in his eyes, not flowing, just brimming, held back like everything else he'd ever felt. I'm sorry, he whispered. I looked at him, truly looked. The man who taught me to read with a newspaper in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The man who disappeared from every piano recital, every school election, every moment that would have cost him even a sliver of pride to acknowledge he was proud of me. I don't need your apology, I said softly. But I needed this moment. To say goodbye, he asked. No, I replied, standing. To say that the chain ends here. Whatever you buried with Grandpa, I'm digging it up. Whatever you poisoned, I'm cleansing. This family deserves truth, not legacy built on lies. His eyes searched mine, but I didn't give him more than that. I'm not staying for the funeral, I added as I stepped toward the door. I've buried enough of you while you were alive. Then I paused, hand on the doorknob. Rest easy, Dad. If there's a heaven, maybe Grandpa will be waiting. With questions. I walked out without looking back. Mitchell never picked cozy places to meet. It was always somewhere slightly offbeat, public enough for safety, private enough for tension. This time it was a rundown jazz bar in Queens called the Blue Note Echo, where the music was loud enough to drown whispers and the lights were dim enough to obscure expressions. I walked in 10 minutes early, scanning the room for his familiar trench coat and careless slouch. He was already there, tucked in the far booth beneath a flickering neon saxophone sign, nursing what looked like a bourbon. I slid into the booth across from him. You look like you haven't slept, I said, folding my hands. He gave me a ghost of a smile. You think I sleep when people like Coleman still walk around free? His voice was low, rough, like gravel soaked in cigarette smoke. But his eyes, they were sharp, wired, dangerous. You said you found something. I leaned in, careful not to let my excitement show too quickly. He nodded and slid a flash drive across the sticky table. This is the edge of the rabbit hole. Offshore accounts, names, dates, and a coded file that I haven't cracked yet. But Victoria, this isn't just about corporate greed anymore. This goes deeper. There are judges, senators. My stomach twisted. You're telling me this conspiracy reaches into Washington? He stared at me, unwavering. I'm telling you this built parts of Washington. The weight of it hit me like a freight train. The watch, the safe, the silent inheritance, all of it had been crumbs. This was the feast. Mitchell leaned back, eyes scanning the crowd behind me. There's a woman listed in one of the transactions. Julia knew her. Charlotte Wexler. I froze. Charlotte Wexler's dead? Exactly, he said. But her name was used to move $300,000 through a shell charity just 2 months ago. Someone's resurrecting ghosts to launder money. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the flash drive. Why tell me this now? He paused. Because you've already risked everything to get here. Because I think your grandfather knew this was coming. And because once this gets out, we're both targets. The jazz band swelled with a brass solo behind us. I stared at the drive, feeling its weight like a loaded gun. He pulled out a folded slip of paper and handed it to me. If I disappear, go here, he said. It's a backup drop site. Don't trust anyone, not even Julia. Especially not Julia if she starts acting strange. I blinked. What do you mean? He hesitated. She's not who she used to be, Victoria. Pain changes people, and sometimes it corrupts them. That hit deeper than I expected. We sat in silence for a beat longer, two people balancing on the edge of something that couldn't be undone. Mitchell broke it. Once you open what's in there, he said, nodding to the drive, you'll have a choice to make. Expose it and risk everything. Or walk away and live. I stood slowly, slipping the flash drive into my coat pocket. I've already made my choice. As I turned to leave, I could feel his eyes on me, like a silent goodbye that neither of us wanted to say out loud. And somehow, I knew. I might never see him again. The next morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach. The kind of knot that tightens when something is terribly wrong, even before you know what. I checked my phone. No messages. Nothing from Mitchell since last night. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. The silence wasn't just unsettling, it was loud. I threw on a coat and headed straight to the backup drop site Mitchell had scribbled on the slip of paper. An abandoned florist's shop in East Harlem, boarded up windows and peeling paint. I circled the block 3 times before slipping into the alley behind it. The back door was cracked open. My heart thundered as I stepped inside. Dust hung in the air like a ghost. On a broken counter lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. My name was written in Mitchell's hurried scrawl. If you're reading this, something's gone wrong. Don't come looking for me. Just finish what we started. You have everything you need. Trust no one, especially not those who claim they're trying to help. I sat down on the cracked tile floor, the letter trembling in my hand. He knew. He knew this might happen, and he still pushed forward anyway. The space was cold, hollow, echoing with the kind of quiet that feels like absence. I checked every corner, opened drawers, tapped walls, looking for more. Another drive, another note, anything. But there was nothing else. Just the letter, and the heavy realization that Mitchell was gone. Not hiding, not laying low. Gone. I stepped back out into the morning light, which felt cruel in its brightness. The world kept spinning like nothing had shifted, but it had. Something deep and irreversible had tilted inside me. I sat on the curb, staring down at the concrete as the city buzzed around me. A part of me wanted to cry, but there were no tears, just steel. He'd handed me the torch, and now the fire was mine to carry. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, a single text. They're watching you. I didn't reply, just stood, tucked the letter into my coat, and walked away without looking back. This was no longer just about revenge. It was survival. And Mitchell had disappeared so I could stay in the game long enough to finish it. It's a gray morning in Portland, the kind where the clouds hang low, like they've decided not to try today. I sip my coffee slowly on the porch of my small house tucked into the northeast corner of the city, barely 900 square feet of reclaimed wood and stubborn hydrangeas. But it's mine. Every nail, every inch, mine. The world has changed, or maybe I have. 5 years ago, I was wrapped in the chaos of betrayal, of secrets buried under wealth and power, of a family legacy poisoned from the inside out. 5 years ago, I walked away with a flash drive in my coat, a man missing, and a fire in my chest I didn't know how to extinguish. Today, that fire has shape, purpose. My nonprofit, the Valen Project, launched 2 years ago. We investigate corporate corruption and whistleblower cases, especially those the system quietly buries. Our latest expose made headlines in The Atlantic. My face was on the front page, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, as a force. And Mitchell? Still no word, no body, no trace. But sometimes, on certain days, I still check my inbox for an anonymous tip signed with his usual alias, Marigold, just in case. I head inside and turn on the radio. A familiar voice fills the room. Julia's. She's hosting Morning Pulse, the country's top political podcast. Her voice is sharper now, more confident. We still meet for tea every few weeks, usually without needing to talk about the past. But every once in a while we do. And we always laugh, even if our eyes are wet. A knock at the door. I open it to find Kara, now 7, cradling a tiny rescue kitten in her arms. "Miss Elise, she doesn't have a name yet," she says with that solemn tone kids use when they know something matters. I kneel down. "How about Marigold?" She lights up. "That's perfect," I smile. "Yeah, it is." As she runs off, I lean against the doorframe and let the moment settle. The past still lingers like the last note of a song. But it doesn't control me. Not anymore. The woman I was, the one who clung to silence, who mistook loyalty for chains, is gone. I've learned that sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's clarity. That the truth can be a blade, yes, but also a key to something better. My final thoughts? You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Family isn't always blood. Justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. And healing, it's not a finish line. It's a choice you make, over and over, every time you get up, every time you speak truth, every time you choose yourself. So if my story spoke to you, if it stirred something buried or gave you permission to want more, then don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and leave a comment. I want to hear your story too, because this isn't just mine. It's ours, and it's only the beginning.